CSI Jerusalem. What we're going to do today is called Crucifixion Scene Investigation. We're going to do a medical discussion of the Passion of Jesus Christ. Have you ever noticed how we in healthcare like to speak in Latin? You know why? We look smarter. And what I like to do, because again, I take care of children, and I need the parents in plain, simple English to understand what has happened to their child so that this child grows up to be as healthy and develop as well as they possibly can, and that they do as well in school and remain healthy. So, what we're going to do today is I'm going to throw out some big words, but we're going to break it down to make sure you understand exactly what happened on Good Friday, almost 2,000 years ago. First of all, it is a murder. I think we can say this was a murder. This is California Penal Code. To be found guilty of first-degree murder, you can read some of this. Why was Jesus killed? And who was responsible? Who were the suspects? There's a very interesting book out, and I've already said I even thought about grabbing, I've read about every book on the subject, and I thought about bringing this. There's one called Killing Jesus, which is a fascinating book. Did you read that? Do you remember the author's name?
Bill Riley.
Well, this one I read wasn't him, though, because that's what maybe I'll have to look again. But anyway, this one book was written very well, and I'm pretty certain it was called Killing Jesus. Anyway, to get more of a backdrop on who are the Pharisees, who are the Sadducees, what's all of this playing out, and how threatening and how radical Jesus really is. So today we're going to talk about the events leading to the execution, what is Roman crucifixion, the sweating of blood. I think you're going to find this very interesting. The proposed causes of Jesus' death. This was actually published by Dr. Joe Bergeron, a former resident of mine. And, so I went to Catholic grade school, so I was the one asked to proofread it before it was published. Implications of shock and trauma-induced coagulopathy. Do we have any pathologists in here today? And then we'll talk about the resurrection. Well, actually, we may skip that last part, but we'll get through as much of this as we can. Let's start off with the Passion of Jesus Christ. The prayer in Gethsemane, 9 p.m. to midnight. Okay? We've got about 3 hours. He goes to the house of Annas at 1 a.m., then goes to the home of Caiaphas. And that's about 2 to 5 a.m. where he was tried and beaten. The Sanhedrin meeting with some of the leaders. Then we have Pontius Pilate at 6 a.m. to Herod. He's returned to Pilate, caned and beaten by a company of soldiers, scourged prior to the execution, delivered to crucifixion, and he's put on the cross at 9 a.m. and he dies by 3. And do you remember what was the reaction of Pontius Pilate and the others? Well, he died rather quickly. 6 hours, is that all? Some people actually hung on the cross for a couple of days or longer. So we have an illustration of the Gethsemane scene. Here's where it starts to get real interesting. You read the New Testament, and it's funny because people always want to question that. It doesn't take much literature from other historical beings. We go, well, that's historically accurate because Caesar said this or did that, right? Well, there's actually quite a bit of historical information about the person of Jesus, right? And we hear, and depending upon, let's take a look at how this is said, his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground, okay? Okay, now some people would probably read that and say, well, it meant he was sweating profusely. Doesn't necessarily mean that his sweat was bloody. I've heard all types of ways to explain this because, of course, we have to find some way to discount any potential miracle. So the question becomes, was it a miracle or was it just phenomenally, historically accurate documentation? Look at this. Hematidrosis, see, that's our big word for today. for those of you who aren't in healthcare, it literally means bloody sweat. Hemato, whenever we have hema, H-E-M-A, blood, and then drosis, we talk about sweating. You put the two together, bloody sweat. Look at this. Research has shown, Holobeck reviewed 76 reported cases. People have sweated blood. 44 of those cases, you have some substantial physiologic process going on. But 32 cases were psychogenic. In other words, the stress, the anguish, the fear was so great, these persons actually sweated blood. Of those 32, there were 9 single episodes. Single episode cases, fear mediated. They were all fear mediated, and you can see what it says there. Fear of death by shipwreck, one case that was fear of rape, and impending execution, typically the day prior to being executed. These people were in such fear, they bled as they sweat. The skin becomes hypersensitive. And we do have one photo here to show you what that might look like. Here's an individual who actually has spontaneous bleeding without stress, but she often would bleed through the sweat glands. It's fascinating, isn't it? I think the important thing here is, you know, for years, even as a kid, I used to tell people, I said, the miracle of Jesus isn't his divinity. The miracle of Jesus is his humanity. Now, I didn't know exactly what I meant by that, but I think the more you really research this, the more obvious that becomes. Knowing he's going home to the Father, you think, yeah, I'll get through a couple, tough day here. No. The human side of him, there was great fear, great stress, great agony, the agony of Gethsemane, and he bled in his sweat. This is actually what it looks like, just so you know, and it's a black and white photo, but how the blood cells, we call those reticulocytes, they bleed. These very, very small blood cells would flow into the sweat duct and come out, and so it's going to look pink to red depending upon the concentration. And then, of course, at some point, they come to take Jesus from the garden. As mentioned, he goes in front of Herod. He goes in front of Pilate. And did you ever wonder, why did Pilate say, I wash my hands of this? Okay? Now again, we live in the United States where we have to get polar opposites so we can argue about something, I guess. But, some people say, well, that doesn't make sense. Obviously, the Jews were responsible for Jesus' crucifixion because no Roman pontiff would actually, no Roman leader would wash his hands and say, follow some Jewish custom. On the other hand, some people might say, well, that would be a pretty good thing to do politically. But if you read this, when you found a body upon property you owned, that was a necessity. The Jewish individual had to wash their hands and say, our hands, as you can see here, our hands did not shed this blood. That's from Deuteronomy 21. And there's a sculpture of Pontius Pilate reported, as if he had followed this. So if you look in Matthew, so Pilate says, what shall I do with Jesus? Now, we have a lot of Catholics here today? I'll tell you something. As a child, I just couldn't bring myself at Mass on Sundays. It's like the priest is reading this and we're supposed to say, crucify him, crucify him. I remember I'd just sit there and keep my mouth shut. It didn't seem like the right thing to do to me, but so again, he washes his hands and says, it's on you. Okay? Now, If you've ever had the opportunity to go to the Holy Land, it's a wonderful experience because you begin to see where all of these things lay out. These aren't remarkable distances. And if we look at where this all started, where Jesus goes from the garden, you got the Garden of Gethsemane, then when he gets taken to Pilate, he goes to Herod, back to Pilate, here's the upper city here, going to the temple, and ultimately to Golgotha. Now, most artistic renditions of the crucifixion show that the nails are put in the palms. And this is probably the most well-known part of all the research, is that most pathologists say, well, it's very unlikely that the nail was put in the palm. It would tear free. Right? And the other part of it is, and unfortunately I couldn't bring in the patibulum today, another big word that we're going to define in just a moment. But remember, Romans were wholesale killers. They were very good at torturing and killing people. Jesus was only, to them, he was only one of many other criminals or problems, Jewish problems that needed to be solved. They probably crucified hundreds of thousands over the time period that they were crucifying people. So let's talk about Roman crucifixion. It originated in Asia Minor, 6th century BC. So right off the bat, you see they weren't the clever people to come up with this, but they got very good at refining it. Okay? Roman Empire actually did crucifixion on their victims 300 BC to 641 AD. 641 years of this sort of capital punishment. Now, here's where it starts to get very interesting from a practical standpoint. The execution team consisted of 5 Romans. Quaterno, 4. 4 soldiers who were the killing machine, and then of course they need to have a supervisor, that being the exactor mortis, the centurion who provided the certificate of death. I found it interesting that we had to have documentation even back then, right? Somebody needs to say, he's dead, I saw it for myself, okay? Now, Crucarius, you've heard terms like crucible, Crucarius, Cruferagium. We're going to start throwing out some words. All of this refers to the cross. C-R-U-X. Okay? So when we say Crucarius, in this case we're talking about Jesus, the person, the victim who was crucified. The patibulum. This is just the crossbeam of the cross. Not the entire cross, just the crossbeam of the cross. Now, I have one in my garage at home, and I went with a cedar beam 5 feet long. These were typically 5 or 6 feet long. Anybody know why I would choose a 5 foot long one? I'd see, yes, it fits. I thought it would fit in the car. That's exactly. That's why I say I love working with people who are compassionate, but you know, have some common sense too. They shot the photo in the news. It was great. He even got my blue shoes. Those are the shoes I have on the back porch. You just slip on when you're. So I'm holding this thing. As I lifted it out, it's made of cedar, 5 feet long. It weighs 95 pounds. See, because most art of the crucifixion, in most of the stations of the cross, Jesus is dragging the entire cross with him. We're going to talk in a moment why that really isn't so practical. Okay? But here's the thing. Just in me reaching in, I even put my gloves on, and I had splinters in my hands. I remember the first time I did this presentation for Sister Norma over at Marian University, I made the mistake of picking the thing up and throwing it on my shoulder, and all afternoon I'm picking these out. So think about that. Even the wood of the cross is extremely painful. We are trying to pull in air. and your skin is rubbing over this, and splinters, and it's horrendous. Every part of this is extremely painful, extremely difficult. Now this we have here, 70 pounds. Estimates are anywhere from, depending on what type of wood and the length of the crossbeam, usually they were 5 to 6 feet long, 65 up to about 105 pounds. Okay? Crucifixion occurred in a conspicuous location. Of course it did. The Romans wanted the other Jews to see, if you cause trouble, this is what we need to do. And then, of course, there are various types of crosses. This is from Spartacus. Now, there were thousands, probably around 8,000 prisoners who lined the Appian Way for quite a distance. And if you do the math, assuming that they're about 30 yards apart, you're probably about 8,000 people hanging on crosses to make a point. This was with the uprising of the slaves with Spartacus. But think about this. How many Roman soldiers does it take to put people up on what look like telephone poles? It's very difficult. You're going to have to put your shoulder into it, you put them down on the ground. That doesn't make as much sense, does it? And the other part is, of course, most people aren't going to willingly allow you to nail them to a cross. So there's got to be a good beating before that. And believe me, Jesus took quite a beating, even in relation to others. There were certain laws about how much they could flog a Jew, but I don't think, if it makes sense, that considering the threat Jesus was, I don't think they were overly concerned about staying below that maximum number. So, as you can see here, this is Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, and that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? You make it visible, you put them up there in certain ways, you change the position, you do some pretty horrible things that will catch people's attention and keep them talking about it. Now, those of you who saw The Passion of the Christ, I think that was pretty realistic in terms of how they were typically supported on the post for the actual flogging. And this is a replica. This is a replica of a flagrum that might have been used. It's got lead weights on it. These, we might use fishing weights or that sort of thing, but the Romans had these types of materials. They would make these beads or dumbbell-shaped pieces that would hang on the end of the leather. The only thing I would say, the leather straps here are probably a little too flimsy. But then they would also put shards of glass or metal, animal bones, teeth in these so that they would catch on to the flesh and pull back. So what happens in this case is that the hemorrhaging, now keep in mind, this process has gone on through the night. We can assume that Jesus was not offered some soft drinks and kept comfortable through this. So he is already dehydrating. He's had the hematidrosis where he sweated blood. So he's lost a lot of body fluid already. He goes through this, and as you can see here, you see small bones, metal balls, leather thongs. This thing was made to be very painful. Here's the thing that was so striking to me about this. If we look at this image, and I want to tell you this photograph here, this is, if you contact the Stera group out in Colorado, this is the full-size image of the shroud as it was photographed in 1978. Barry Schwartz was the documenting photographer. He's become a very good personal friend of mine, and we travel around lecturing on. He emphasizes more the authenticity of the shroud. We talk about what actually happened to Jesus. But if you look at the back, of this victim, it's phenomenal how much damage was done over the shoulders, and you will even see on the front image how it sometimes wraps around, because typically, as you see here, the Roman soldiers are hitting from the side. There might be two soldiers, or maybe they're over here, and then they step to this side and deliver from the opposite side. But what will catch your attention, if you take a close look, the flogging, the scourging goes all the way down to the ankles, the calves, the back of the legs, everything. So it was quite a beating, quite a bloodletting, even before he goes to Calvary. And of course, Isaiah, when we talk about fulfillment of the scripture, offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. And of course, we know he was mocked and spit upon. Now, when it comes time to actually carry the cross, you see, these are the three. That's not real focus, but these are basically the four types, models of how the cross was made. And what I want to point out to you is this one here. You have the stipes, which is the vertical component, the patibulum. You see this? The vertical piece here, the stipes, and the horizontal piece, the patibulum. Okay. If I got a lot of people I need to kill in a single day, we don't want to spend a lot of time putting them up on telephone pole height. Truth be told, most of these stipes were probably only about 6 feet off the ground. The individual has been beaten. He carries, or she carries, only the patibulum to the site where they will be nailed to the cross. Now, some people were tied to the cross, and some were tied and then nailed. And again, there comes these practical things of like, how much is someone going to fight you to go to this sort of death, right? So the patibulum has a little notch in it. You're carrying this through the streets, again, drawing as much attention as you can from the populace, because you want to make this clear, we're not going to tolerate that sort of behavior. Jesus goes through the crowd carrying just the crossbeam and falls. In fact, even on the shroud, there's evidence of a bruise or contusion underneath the eye, and gets there. Now he's nailed to just the crossbeam. And you see, if you have 4 soldiers and one who's going, you're doing it right, he's looking after him, these 4 soldiers now, all they have to do is sort of suppress this victim's, I would imagine some people are kicking and in horrible, excruciating pain, but they lift that up and just lock it in place. So truth be told, the victim, the Crucifixion, is probably no more than 1 foot, maybe 16 inches from your face. Okay? Maybe, depending on the actual height of the stipes, you might be face to face with this person. Now, I did bring in a crown of thorns, and I think it's important to tell you that we, from the research, don't believe that a crown of thorns was fabricated. You're going to stick yourself pretty good just trying to do that. Basically, they probably went to this bush, which is very prevalent in that area, and gathered together, and you can see how sharp this. Be very careful when you're taking a look at that. Bunched them together and just slammed him on his head. And if you take a look at the blood pattern on the scalp, and then particularly after you've done a photograph of that scalp, there's evidence that blood is coming from the top of the scalp as well as around. Something more like this. Something more like this. So, again, 5 feet, 6 feet, even up to 125 pounds there, 75 to 125, depending on what documents you read on this, but that's probably more realistic. Now think about this. You've taken a serious beating and now you're walking with that much weight tied to your arms. You fall. You are going to do a face plant on the street. The titulus, by the way, here, Titulus, the title board. If you're going to crucify someone, you want to make it clear why this is being done, and typically that was done in Greek, Aramaic, and Latin. Jesus, King of the Jews. Okay. Now, by the way, most crosses, I might throw this in real quick. You look at most crosses as INRI, right? You don't have the full components of what are actually on that titulus. It's just an abbreviation for the letters, the first letter in each word there. And then you get an idea, again, how would that look? Well, is it a little post up above? More likely you're just putting it up above the head on the patibulum. And amazingly enough, this is a Russian artist rendition of what that might have looked. And, you know, some of us had talked about it and said, he's probably pretty darn close. Probably pretty darn close. Some people, we do know, the nails were not driven through the tops of the feet, but the one archaeological evidence we have of Roman crucifixion, the nail was actually put through the heel laterally into the stipes. All of this would be horribly, horribly, horribly painful. Now, I got talking with some of my other doctor friends about this, and I said, you know, truth be told, it's probably easier to nail someone through the ankles to the side, because it'd be harder to kick against that. To fight someone trying to put you on a cross. On the other hand, that calls for 2 nails, not 1. And the Romans recycled. See, this is one of the things we started talking about too, is that, you know, the stipes, the patibulum, they were reused. You're being hung on a cross that's probably covered with feces, blood, urine, and other body substances. And it's probably very likely, as we just said, that you're not that high off the ground, and the legs would be put into some flexion. And now you have this horrible decision of how are you going to pull a breath? Do you pull up? Do you push up? Do you pull up and push up? All the while you're fatiguing, wearing out. And the best example I can give people is if you've ever broken a bone, that lancinating, burning pain, and I'm sure something all of us have experienced is you hit the funny bone, that electrical shock. See, the Romans were really good at this. You put those nails where they're going to either cut through the nerve or at least rub against the nerve. That's where the median nerve is. But at the same time, guess what? It's so cleverly placed it doesn't cause a rupture of any of the arteries. So they don't bleed out real quick. Okay? Give you an idea, the nail that we have here, this one here, I have purchased some of these because I was curious what the replicas look like. This is a 6-inch nail here. The one that I have is probably about 5 inches, and it's not so large, not so big. I don't think you would need, again, if you may tie and nail the victim. And remember, you're going to have at least 2 points of suspension here, and then also the legs. Now, most art, we see that the nail is put in the palm, and that is quite possible. But 2 things have come up. People debate this. They say, well, you know, back then, when they talked about the hand, they did not distinguish the wrist from the hand. So perhaps the nail was actually put through the wrist. But just because of the way our hands are made, if you put a nail between these muscles and the tissue down here, the bones, it is quite possible that would rip free. But you can still put it in the wrist and angle it at such a way that you lock it into what we call the metacarpals, kind of the wrist bones, and that would allow for suspension. We have had pathologists over the years who have used cadavers to prove that sort of theory, that it can be done. And if each of you if you go like that and bend your hand, you see how that forms that groove. Now you just angle here and put the nail in. So it looks something like this. So it's angled a bit towards the wrist, even though it was actually placed in the palm. And that's the how it looks the way drawn by Dr. Netter, who did so much work in medical illustration. And you get an idea. 5 to 7 inch nail. As I said, I think the one I have is probably more along the lines of 5 inch. And take a look at that. See how the artery, you got the ulnar artery and the radial artery, they loop around, form that U shape there. So the blood continues to flow, but you are right near the median nerve, maybe transecting it. It would be very, very, very painful. Again, Psalms 22:17-18. We even get into a little bit of geometry. Now, we could say, well, the Romans were phenomenal scientists. I would suggest, no, they just killed enough people this way that they found this is better than that. And ironically enough, you discover that that's probably the best angle to suspend someone with the upper extremities to make it as painful, intolerable, difficult to breathe as possible. So, what archaeological evidence do we have about Roman crucifixion? Well, believe it or not, 1968, they actually did come up with some. Hard to see it in this photograph, but I'm going to give you another picture. You know, pathologists are going to take a look at this. The orthopedic surgeon will say, wait a minute, that doesn't look quite right. That's why it does not look right. This man, who they estimated to be about 22 years old, Jewish man, they had an ossuary, a bone box. And they found this calcaneus with a nail through the side of the heel bone. The calcaneus is the heel bone, so it's put through the side. And here's the interesting thing. It's the only one we've ever found in these digs. Why is that? The Romans recycled, you see. And what's interesting, though, is if you look at the end of this, let me see if it's a little, yeah, there you go. See that? It's got a little hook in it, doesn't it? So you imagine that these individuals who are crucifying the person, the quaternary, they're pounding that nail in. It might hit a knot in the wood, hooks over, and so they weren't able to extract this one. So we do end up having a Roman nail in place to show this, because otherwise this is all you'd find in that bone box. Now let's go to this. Okay? Remember I said everything's in reference to the cross, so this is Crucifixion. Crucifixion. What happens? Okay, so the individual's been hanging on the cross for 24 hours, or maybe 48 hours. And you know what? We got a lot more people that need to be killed. And they're able to push up and pull up, and they're lasting longer than expected. So eventually, one of these four would break the legs. So now the individual's hanging there and is no longer able to use the legs to push up and draw air. Okay. Now that we know did not happen in Jesus' case, because he didn't last as long as they expected, right? And again, there's that photo. Now, what are the proposed causes of death? Doctors come up with all kinds of things. This has been researched for years, and I've always found it interesting how this stuff never seems to make it into the media. Just as we talk about near-death experiences, and I've taken care of a lot of children who've died and met Jesus, or get resuscitated and tell me about that, or they meet their guardian angel, and the media, I don't think quite knows how to deal with some of that. But pulmonary embolus, okay? So imagine that blood clot forms in the leg, floats up to the heart, gets pumped in the lung, you die of that blood clot going to the lung. Another one is cardiac rupture, where the heart basically gets damaged bad enough that when it pumps finally, it breaks and bleeds out. I'm going to go into a little more detail on that. Orthostasis, suspension trauma, asphyxiation, fatal stab wound from the spear, or shock. And we're going to cover each of those. So the broken heart hypothesis, this was presented as early as 1847, 1887, probably when spirituality was much more a common part of the healing profession, right? Think about this. We didn't have antibiotics back then. We didn't have, prayer often was what you might resort to as a doctor, as a nurse. And so 1847, 1887, could Jesus have had a heart attack? And with the contusions from the beatings, the fall, he goes down, maybe hits his chest. One of the considerations. Basically, this is speculative, and again, in the research that Dr. Joe Bergeron did and the other individuals, this doesn't seem so likely, as you can see there at the bottom. It would have happened much more rapidly, more likely. Suffocation is another possibility. You look at 1925, 1936, and sister, you and I were talking about suspension of, in fact, in the concentration camps, some Jewish prisoners were suspended, typically with the arms drawn behind, and put on the single, not a cross per se, but a single stake where they're suspended by their arms. And they typically did not last more than about 3 hours. Now, when we're talking about somebody on the Roman cross and pulling up to breathe, you see, we say inhalation. Normal breathing is active, passive in the crucified victim to inhale. Again, imagine you are, and as the pain of that and drawing in, and one of the things that was often overlooked was the fact that you're going to collect fluid around those lungs. I mean, he took quite a beating even before he was put up there. And to go through this, and the fluid, we call that pleural effusion, that collects around the lungs. So less and less space, and you're fatiguing, and it's extremely painful, and it takes an incredible amount of effort to try to move air. The criticisms of this, well, again, as I mentioned earlier, the arms were typically suspended directly overhead with the legs unsupported. You see, again, if Romans were really trying to save time, you'd think they might go ahead and just nail or suspend the arms and leave the legs dangling. But then you don't have a way to speed it up. You want to make this excruciating. You want to make it last. So here's an interesting piece to look at. 4,320 leg push-ups required for a respiratory rate of 12 minutes for 6 hours. Now, when we say respiratory rate, we're also assuming that they're getting the normal volume of air, but I guarantee you, suspended like that and in pain and with fluid collecting, you're not getting that much. The rate's going to pick up, and then again, you don't want to pull in that breath because of the pain. Oh, by the way, I mentioned Zugaby. This is the author that I probably has done the most. He writes more in a medical literature point of view, but it's an outstanding article that's been deciphered by myself and some others. But those of you who are in the medical profession would probably find Zugaby's book very interesting. Okay, so the other thing here, and this is another interesting piece of the historical accuracy of the New Testament, but coming to Jesus, when they saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And this was talked of as this miracle, right? Blood and water. And you can think of how much, interestingly enough, think of the symbolism of that. Turning water into wine, and wine representing the blood of Christ. Well, guess what? The research indicates, We can call it miraculous, but I think it's incredibly accurate what they're describing. Okay? So, was Jesus alive at the time of the spear chest wound? The spear tapped a pleural effusion. You see, again, not like we typically see in art where they're going up. This Roman soldier is almost walking face to face and driving the spear into Jesus' chest. Now, if you look at the shroud, it appears that the wound is on the left side. But don't forget, the shroud is actually 14 feet long, 3.5 feet wide. Anybody know why? 14 feet long, 3.5 feet wide. Yes, it's a billfold. If you think, we'll pull this up, lie the body down, lay this over, and the reason it's exactly those measurements. Now, the width has changed because of how it's been suspended for exhibits and those sorts of things in the past. It's 4 cubits by 1 cubit, which is exactly what it had to be for the proper burial of a Jew in the first century in that area. And it had to be only one type of cloth. This is a linen cloth, 4 cubits by 1. And so you get the full image. Someone said, well, why do you suppose they did that? And I said, well, we wouldn't have a very good picture if they didn't. The history laid the groundwork for all of this. So this is pulled over, and so you see the posterior of the victim, back side of the victim, the front side of the victim. The victim being 5'10" or 5'11", approximately 180 to 185 pounds. Okay? If we're going to do a path report with, the victim appears to be 5'10", 5'11", weighing 180, 185 pounds. Barry Schwartz, who was the documenting photographer for the Stirp team in 1978, has become a good friend of mine. He's the one that shot all these pictures, did all the documentation, has done all the work on the authenticity, and he likes to say, now he's Jewish, and he likes to go, Chuck, your Savior was no wimp. Barry also likes to say, he goes, well, God always sends a Jew to be the messenger. And one thing that he says that I think is very important is, look, I don't have a horse in this race. I'm giving you the facts. This is what this is. The last time I got together with a bunch of, we now get called shroudies, we had Jews, Protestants, Catholics, and agnostics, and the word I heard around that table more and more, it's like every other word, truth. It's about truth. No, it's truth. It's got to be about truth. This isn't religion or faith. And in fact, you remember years ago, 1988, when they did the carbon dating, that proved the shroud is a fake. It's a hoax. Well, I won't tell you exactly what Barry says about these guys, but there are 3 of them are standing there like this in front of the pillars, and truth be told, it's pretty certain they knew that the samples that were carbon dated were contaminated. You see, nuns had repaired this before, had done a weave to make it so it wasn't apparent, and so there was some cotton in there. And again, that violates the laws, the Jewish laws of burial. Linen, it has to be a single type. And there's linen with some cotton woven in. Now, what's always fun for me, there's typically some ladies in the audience who do sewing or maybe seamstresses, and they look at this and they're very impressed with the work that the nuns did. But ultimately, Barry likes to point out that the man, I think he was from Cambridge, I don't believe he was at Oxford, one of the English scholars who was involved in the dating, 1 month after they declared it a fake, he got a 1 million pound donation to get a new laboratory in his new, so, and somehow scientists are supposed to really stick to the science, right? Anyway, so here's what gets very interesting, though, the fatal stab wound hypothesis, and we say, well, how can this bleed? If he's dead, how does he get stabbed with a spear? And in this case, I'm going to point it out up here, okay? Right side of the chest here, okay? Think about the 5th intercostal space, we believe. We always look at, trying to get the estimates on these things and how that would clip into the lung and then go to the heart. So if we look at this, it was considered a miraculous sign. And here's what a pleural effusion might look like, some pleural fluid collecting around. Now this is where the individual's lying down and getting a CT scan, and as we're looking up from the bottom, okay, so you have the heart here, the heart is here, and then this is where the fluid is. But if you're upright on a cross, it collects down here, the spear goes in, so clear fluid and blood would come out. So, I remember this article in the Journal of American Medical Association. There you go. Clearly the evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before, and notice it says historical and medical evidence indicates that he was dead before he was pierced with the sword. And now what's interesting about that, is we were just beginning to understand all this in the early 80s, mid 80s. And we talk about hypovolemic shock. Shock isn't like, shock is where we've lost enough fluids, we've lost enough blood, the heart's pounding, it can't perfuse or send enough blood to the organs, and things start to shut down. The pH in the blood starts to drop because we create lactic acid, we start getting an abnormal rhythm of the heart, and eventually this leads to death. What are the clues that Jesus died of shock? Well, sweating, blood loss, the pleural effusion, no fluid for quite some time, weak and fainting, and as I mentioned earlier, that's only 500 meters, that whole distance where he goes from one palace to another, confronting, being confronted by these individuals and then carrying the cross, and then of course he cried out in thirst in John 19. And this is where it gets real interesting. Eventually, we got enough medical research to find that 25% of trauma hospital presentation, 4 to 6 times fold likelihood of fatality. You look at this stuff here, shock, tissue injury, hemorrhage, hypothermia, acidemia, which as I mentioned, the pH of the blood starts to go down because the tissues are starting to die off, and you get inflammation throughout the system. Why is that important? Notice clotting time is much less when you're at 35 degrees Celsius. Notice in Jerusalem during the first week of April, 8 to 14 Celsius is the average temperature. So all factors are leading to the fact that Jesus will bleed out even after death. This was actually published in the media as the, quote, unholy trinity, where bleeding, acidosis, and hypothermia led to coagulopathy. So the point is, even though he's dead, the spear wound makes certain of that, but the fluid and the blood that come out are just confirmation of something that we discovered 1900 years later. Okay? Cause of death, cardiac and respiratory arrest due to hypovolemic and traumatic shock due to crucifixion. And again, this is Zugabe. So, I'll leave it there. I tried to avoid a lot of the stuff that's the actual authentication of the shroud. I mean, at some point I'll have to have Barry come here with me, and it's fascinating. But, even when this shroud was first examined back in 1978, they found the pollens, they found evidence of botanical components on this, so that we're from the Middle East, typically in that area of Jerusalem, with that would be in bloom during that time of year. It's a fascinating study. Now, some people say, well, what are these big triangles here? These are the triangles that were sewn in by the nuns after the fire. Isn't it remarkable? The shroud has survived two, not one, two fires, and yet most of the damage is on either side of the image, so we still end up with a pretty remarkable image. You can look at blood flow on the feet. You can look at blood flow on the arms. Take a look at that for a moment. Why do we have blood on the forearm here in this sort of pattern, and we have it here, which appears to be a little more, it's a different angle? There's a good explanation for it. Right? There is evidence of the contusion under the right eye. This is the hair and the beard of a first century Jewish man. And as you put all this stuff together, and I remember, when Barry and I were talking about this one time, and we both were saying the same thing. If this were Caesar, everybody'd say, that's fascinating. Let's bring this out and talk more about it. But this is such contention because we are talking about Jesus, right? Here's the stuff. I'll leave this up. Let's stop there, and I'll be happy to hang around and chat with you about any questions you have. Thanks a lot.